Some shows make fun of the people who run things. South Park made a children's show stand in for a national intelligence agency and let a fourth grader expose it. It made Santa Claus the center of a nationwide spying program. It made an iPad company kidnap a child over a contract nobody read. It turned a neighborhood drone hobby into a citywide riot with armed police circling overhead. It sent a talking towel to Washington and showed tanks parked outside the White House. Over the next few hours, we are going to walk slowly through the episodes where South Park looked at the government, the agencies that watch its citizens, and the strange, quiet space between safety and control where most of modern life is now lived. The whistleblower who wanted attention and got none. The DMV that became a church. The drones that turned on each other. The towel that walked into an occupied Capitol. Welcome to East Park. Let's get started. The day Cartman became a whistleblower. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a school bus on a Wednesday morning when nothing has happened yet, but everyone can feel that something is about to. South Park, the town, did not know it on the morning this story begins. The kids climbed onto the bus the same way they always did. Cartman shoving his way to a seat, Kyle pulling his hood up against the cold, Stan staring out the window with the specific blankness of someone who has accepted that the day ahead will be long. None of them had any idea that within a few hours, one of them would walk into a federal building, talk his way past security using nothing but confidence and a forged badge, and come out the other side claiming to be the most important person in the country. This is where the story starts. Not with sirens, not with a raid, not with helicopters circling overhead. It starts with Cartman sitting in the back of a classroom, talking. He had been talking for days. He had been talking about one thing in particular, and the thing he had been talking about was the government. Specifically, the National Security Agency, an organization most of the kids in his class had never heard of and would not have been able to define if asked. Cartman, however, seemed to know everything about it, or at least seemed convinced that he did, which in his case had always been close enough. The National Security Agency is a real organization. It exists. It has existed for decades, headquartered in Fort Meade, Maryland, tasked officially with signals intelligence and information security for the United States government. For most of its history, it operated in a kind of institutional shadow, known by acronym to people who followed politics closely and almost completely invisible to everyone else. That changed abruptly and permanently in the summer of 2013 when a government contractor named Edward Snowden walked out of a facility in Hawaii carrying a portable hard drive loaded with classified documents and got on a plane to Hong Kong. What followed was one of the largest intelligence disclosures in American history. Snowden's leaks revealed the scope of a domestic surveillance program that collected metadata on phone calls, internet activity, and communications on a scale that most ordinary people had not imagined was technically possible, let alone legally permitted. The story dominated headlines for months. It split public opinion down lines that did not map neatly onto traditional politics. Some people called Snowden a hero. Others called him a traitor. Almost everyone, regardless of which side they landed on, agreed that the conversation about government surveillance had changed permanently and would not be changing back. South Park returned for its 17th season a few weeks after that story had fully detonated across the news cycle, and the premiere episode walked directly into it. The episode is called Let Go, Let Gov, and it opens with Cartman already deep into an obsession. He has decided that the government is spying on everyone, that this spying is happening through phones, emails, and social media, and that he, personally, is one of the people being watched most closely. He is not subtle about this belief. He brings it up constantly to anyone who will listen and to several people who very clearly do not want to listen, chief among them Kyle, who spends much of the episode's early stretch trying and failing to get Cartman to talk about literally anything else. The repetition matters here. A single line about the NSA watching everyone would be a throwaway joke, but the episode does not give Cartman one line. It gives him dozens, spread across every early scene, until the joke stops being about the content of what he is saying and becomes about the sheer volume of it. Kyle's frustration becomes a stand-in for the audience's own experience of the news cycle that summer, when a single story seemed to swallow every conversation, every headline, every casual exchange between people who had nothing to do with intelligence agencies and never would. Cartman, in this sense, is not just a kid with an obsession. He is the embodiment of an entire cultural moment compressed into one extremely loud fourth grader. What makes this opening work, and what makes it more than just a topical reference dropped into a script for the sake of relevance, is the specific shape of Cartman's conviction. He is not afraid of the surveillance. He is not worried about what the government might do with information about him. He is instead almost flattered by the idea. Somewhere in his mind, the notion that the NSA might be watching his every move has become evidence of his own importance. If they are watching him, he reasons, it must be because he mattered. The fear that most people would feel at the idea of being monitored by a powerful faceless agency is, for Cartman, inverted entirely into to a kind of validation. He wants to be watched. He is almost disappointed by the idea that nobody is paying attention to him specifically. This inversion is the joke, but it is also the argument, and the two things are doing different work even though they happen in the same lines of dialogue. The joke is that Cartman, a fourth grader from a small mountain town, believes himself to be a person of interest to one of the most powerful intelligence agencies on the planet. The argument, sitting underneath that joke and not really hidden at all, is about a specific kind of modern self-importance that had been growing for years before this episode aired and has only grown louder since. Somewhere in the cultural conversation about surveillance, there had emerged a strange undercurrent. People who genuinely seemed to want to believe they were being watched, because being watched implied being significant, implied being a threat worth tracking, implied mattering in a world that otherwise made very few of us feel like we mattered at all. Cartman is that undercurrent given a body and a voice. He spends the episode's opening stretch performing outrage about privacy violation, while simultaneously craving the attention those violations would represent, and the gap between what he says he wants and what he actually wants is where the comedy lives. There is also something worth sitting with in how the other kids respond to Cartman during this stretch, because their response is its own quiet commentary. Kyle is annoyed, but not alarmed. He treats Cartman's NSA obsession the way he treats most of Cartman's obsessions, as background noise to be endured rather than a claim to be evaluated. Stan barely reacts at all. None of the kids ask the obvious follow-up question, which is whether any of what Cartman is saying might actually be true. The real-world surveillance program that inspired this entire storyline was, by the time this episode aired, a matter of public record, confirmed by leaked documents and acknowledged in some form by the government itself. And yet inside the world of the episode, Cartman's claims land as the ravings of an attention-seeking child, indistinguishable from his usual nonsense. The show is quietly pointing out that even when something extraordinary turns out to be true, the person delivering that truth can still come across as someone not worth listening to, simply because of who they are and how they have chosen to say it. Eventually, talking is not enough. Cartman decides he needs proof. He decides the only way to confirm what he believes about the NSA is to go inside it, see the files for himself, and find out exactly what they have on him. So he does something that, on paper, sounds like the premise of a much darker thriller. He travels to the actual headquarters of the National Security Agency, walks up to the building, and talks his way inside. The way he does this is, in keeping with the character, almost insultingly simple. He does not hack anything. He does not use elaborate disguises or forged credentials built from stolen identity. He simply walks in, acting as though he belongs there, with the specific, unblinking confidence that has gotten Cartman into and out of situations no fourth grader should ever have access to across the entire run of the show. It works. Of course it works. It always works, because the premise of Cartman's character has never been that he is clever in any conventional sense. It is that the world around him is far more permeable than it has any right to be, and that confidence alone, applied without hesitation or self-doubt, can open doors that should require considerably more than confidence. Worth pausing on too is what this says about the building itself, and by extension, the institution it represents. One of the most heavily resourced intelligence agencies in the world, an organization capable of the kind of large-scale data collection that had just become the biggest news story in the country, is shown as an environment so unremarkable, so procedurally loose, that a child can simply enter it. There are no dramatic security checkpoints in this version of the NSA. There is no tension as Cartman approaches the entrance. The building functions, in the world of the episode, less like a fortress and more like an ordinary office park, populated by ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, which turns out to be exactly the point the episode is building toward, even if it has not said so yet. Once inside, Cartman meets an NSA employee named Chief Joe, who becomes his unofficial tour guide through the building, and more importantly, through the episode's central reveal. Chief Joe is not hostile. He is not suspicious. He treats Cartman's presence with the same mild, slightly weary courtesy that a low-level government employee might extend to anyone who wandered in off the street, which is itself part of the joke. There is no security theater here, no tension, no sense that Cartman has infiltrated anything dangerous. He has simply walked into a building and started talking to people, and the people have started talking back, openly, casually, as though discussing the weather rather than classified surveillance infrastructure. This is the moment where the episode begins doing its real work, because what Chief Joe tells Cartman, and what Cartman sees as he is shown around, forms the spine of everything this section needs to establish before we move into what the NSA is actually doing with all of this information, and why the answer to that question is so much stranger and so much funnier than anything Cartman could have imagined when he first started talking about being watched. The boy who wanted desperately to be important enough to spy on is about to discover something far more unsettling than his own surveillance file. He is about to discover who, or what, the government is actually using to keep track of everyone else. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartman walked into the NSA expecting to find proof that he mattered, and what he found instead was almost worse. The next section is about what the NSA is actually using to watch the entire country, and it involves a figure most people only think about once a year. Section 2. Santa Claus is watching you inside the National Security Agency. Cartman is led further into the building by Chief Joe, and what happens next is the kind of reveal that depends entirely on its delivery. If this information were presented with any sense of drama, any hint that something sinister was being uncovered, the joke would collapse immediately. Instead, the episode does the opposite. Chief Joe explains the agency's surveillance capabilities the way someone might explain a filing system, calmly, plainly, without any acknowledgement that what he is describing should be alarming. And what he describes, stripped of all the buildup that real surveillance stories usually come wrapped in, is this. The National Security Agency keeps track of nearly every person in America using Santa Claus. Before going further, it helps to sit with how strange that sentence is, even after you have heard the explanation that follows it. Santa Claus, in the world of this episode, is not a metaphor. He is not a symbol being invoked for comic effect in a single throwaway line. He is presented as an actual operational component of a real surveillance apparatus, physically present, hooked up to a machine, functioning as a kind of living server that the agency uses to monitor the behavior of the entire population. The premise leans on something every American child grows up absorbing without ever questioning it. The idea that Santa Claus knows who has been naughty and who has been nice. That idea has existed for generations as a piece of holiday folklore, repeated constantly every December, treated as charming, treated as harmless, treated as exactly the kind of soft moral pressure that gets applied to children to encourage good behavior during the one time of year when behavior matters most to parents trying to get through the holidays without incident. What the episode does is take that piece of folklore completely literally and then ask what it would actually mean if it were true. If Santa really does know who has been naughty and who has been nice, on a scale covering every household in the country, every year, continuously, then what he possesses is not holiday magic. What he possesses is a real-time behavioral surveillance database covering the entire population, updated constantly, with no opt-out and no oversight. The episode does not spend time explaining this logic to the viewer in so many words. It does not need to. It simply shows Santa, plugged into the machine, functioning as the thing the NSA uses to know who the real threats are, and lets the implication sit there because the implication was always sitting there, buried inside something so familiar that nobody had ever looked at it directly. It is worth pausing on the specific image the episode uses here, because the image itself is doing more work than it might seem to at first glance. Santa Claus, hooked up to a machine, is not presented as something being done to him against his will. There is no sense in how the episode stages this that Santa is a prisoner, or a victim, or even particularly bothered by his role in any of this. He simply exists, connected, functioning, the way a server in a data center simply exists, connected, functioning, without anyone walking past it giving much thought to what it is actually doing or what it contains. The horror of the image, to the extent that it is horrifying at all, comes precisely from how unremarkable it looks. A machine humming quietly in the background of a government building, with Santa Claus attached to it, is not staged as a shocking discovery. It is staged as something Chief Joe walks past on a regular basis, something he can point out to a visitor with the same tone he might use to point out a water cooler. This is where the episode's central joke about Cartman pays off in a way that recontextualizes everything from the section before. Cartman spent days insisting that the government was watching everyone, that surveillance was happening on a massive scale, that ordinary people's lives were being monitored constantly by an agency most of them would never see or understand. He was right. He was completely right. And the mechanism by which he was right is something that every single person watching this episode and every single person in the world of the episode has known about since early childhood, has repeated to other children, has used as a behavioral tool, and has never once considered a surveillance system because it arrived wrapped in red and white and attached to a story about reindeer. There is something genuinely unsettling about how casually Chief Joe delivers this information, and the casualness is doing real work. He does not present Santa's role as a secret in the sense of something hidden behind locked doors and classified stamps. He presents it as simply how things work, the way someone might explain that traffic lights control intersections, or that mail gets sorted by zip code. The surveillance is not hidden because it is too sensitive to discuss. It is hidden because it has been disguised as something else for so long, and so successfully, that nobody inside the system needs to hide it anymore. The disguise has become permanent. Santa Claus is not a cover story that the NSA invented. He is a piece of cultural infrastructure that already existed, that already already had universal buy-in from the entire population, that already operated on the exact premise the agency needed, and all the agency had to do was plug into something that was already running. This is worth slowing down on, because it is the difference between an episode that is simply referencing a news story and an episode that is making an actual argument about how surveillance functions in practice. The real-world conversation about government surveillance, the one that exploded in 2013 and never fully went away, tended to focus on technology, phone records, email metadata, server access. The language was technical, the mechanisms were largely invisible, and the public reaction was often shaped by how frightening or how abstract those mechanisms sounded. South Park sidesteps all of that technical language entirely and replaces it with something that requires no explanation at all, because the audience already understands it completely. Everyone knows the Santa story. Everyone grew up with it, and by routing the surveillance reveal through something this familiar, the episode makes an argument that would have been much harder to make directly, that the systems people accept without question are often the systems doing the most work precisely because nobody thinks to question them. There is a kind of generational layering happening here too, one that the episode does not draw attention to directly, but that becomes visible once you start thinking about who actually tells children the Santa story and why. Parents tell their children that Santa is watching, that he knows whether they have been good or bad, almost always with the explicit goal of shaping behavior in the short term, getting through a few difficult weeks of the year with slightly less conflict than might otherwise occur. The story is told as a kind of benevolent fiction, something everyone involved eventually understands was never literally true, a tool that served its purpose and was then quietly retired once the child grew old enough to stop believing it. What the episode does is take that retirement and reverse it. The story was never retired, it simply moved from something told to children to something built into the infrastructure of the adults those children become. Except now, nobody is telling anyone the story directly, because nobody needs to. The behavioral conditioning happened decades ago, in childhood, and what remains is simply the residue of that conditioning. A population that has spent its entire life primed to accept the idea of constant behavioral monitoring as something warm, something protective, something associated with presence and good cheer, rather than something that should provoke any kind of resistance. Cartman's reaction to all of this is, in its own way, the most honest response any character has to anything in the episode, and it is honest precisely because it is so completely beside the point. He does not react with horror at the scale of the surveillance. He does not raise questions about consent, about oversight, about what happens to all the information Santa is apparently collecting on every household in the country. What Cartman wants to know, more than anything else, is what his own file says. He wants to know if he is on the list. He wants to know if the agency considers him a threat. The revelation that the government is tracking the behavior of literally everyone in America through a mechanism hiding inside one of the most beloved figures in Western childhood registers for Cartman primarily as an opportunity to find out whether he, personally, has been flagged as important. And here the episode delivers its second gut punch, quieter than the first, but in some ways more pointed. Cartman is told that he is not considered a threat. He is not on any meaningful list. As far as the agency is concerned, he is exactly what he appears to be, a kid from a small town, unremarkable, not worth the attention he has spent the entire episode insisting he deserves. The machine that monitors the naughty and nice behavior of the entire country has processed Cartman's information along with everyone else's, and the conclusion it has reached about him is nothing. He is noise. He is data that gets collected and filed away without ever rising to the level of significance. This lands differently depending on which thread of the episode you are following. On one level, it is simply more material for the running joke about Cartman's ego, another instance of him expecting the world to confirm his own importance and being quietly, devastatingly told that it does not. But on another level, it says something about the nature of mass surveillance that is easy to miss if you are only watching for the joke. The system being described here is not one that targets individuals based on some judgment about who matters and who does not. It is a system that collects information about everyone indiscriminately as a baseline condition, regardless of whether any individual person within that dataset is interesting, dangerous, or significant in any way. Cartman wanted to be seen as a threat. What he discovers instead is that the surveillance does not work that way. It does not single people out for attention. It simply runs continuously in the background of everyone's life, whether they are interesting or not, whether they are aware of it or not, whether they want it or not. There is also something worth noting about how the episode chose to frame this reveal as happening inside the NSA itself, rather than as something Cartman discovers through outside investigation. He is not piecing this together from leaked documents or whispered rumors. He is being told directly by an employee of the agency in the agency's own building, without any sense that this information is is being protected or concealed from him. The transparency is total, and the transparency is part of the joke because it suggests an institution that has become so confident in the invisibility of its methods that it no longer feels any need to actually hide them. Why would it need to? The cover story is Santa Claus. Nobody is going to expose Santa Claus. Nobody is going to write the headline. The disguise is so complete that it does not require concealment, only acceptance. And acceptance was secured decades ago, one Christmas Eve at a time, by parents telling children a story that everyone involved assumed was simply about presents. By the end of this stretch of the episode, Cartman has gotten exactly what he came for, and exactly nothing he wanted. He has confirmed that the government is in fact watching everyone through a system more pervasive and more deeply embedded in everyday life than anything he had imagined when he started talking about it days earlier. And he has confirmed in the same breath that none of it has anything to do with him. The surveillance is real, the surveillance is total, and Cartman, the boy who spent an entire episode convinced he was at the center of it, is simply one more name in a file that nobody is reading. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartman has the truth now, the kind of truth most people spend their whole lives wondering about, and it has changed nothing about how anyone sees him. The next section follows what he does with that truth, and the strange, quiet way the people around him decide they would rather not have it at all. Section 3, Butters and the Religion of Government. While Cartman is inside the National Security Agency, discovering that the entire population is being monitored through a system disguised as a children's holiday figure, something else is happening back in South Park, and it is happening in the quietest possible way. It starts at Butters' front door, with two visitors holding pamphlets, the kind of visitors most people in most neighborhoods have learned to recognize from a distance and avoid if at all possible. Two Jehovah's Witnesses arrive at the Stotch house, ready to deliver the message they have delivered at countless other doors before this one, expecting the conversation to go the way these conversations almost always go: a polite refusal, a closed door, maybe a slightly longer exchange if the person answering is feeling generous with their time that day. What they get instead is Butters. Butters Stotch has always occupied a specific role in South Park, a role that is easy to describe and much harder to actually sit with once you start paying attention to what it implies. He is the character the show uses, again and again, to demonstrate what happens when a genuinely good-natured person is dropped into a world that does not reward good nature, does not protect innocence, and frequently uses both as raw material for whatever chaos happens to be unfolding that week. Butters is not stupid. That distinction matters. He is trusting. He is earnest. He wants to believe the best about people and about institutions, and those qualities, which in almost any other context would be considered virtues, function in South Park as a kind of vulnerability. Butters is the character things happen to. He absorbs whatever message is currently circulating through town and processes it with total sincerity, without the protective layer of cynicism that almost every other character, even the children, carries around as a matter of course. So when the two missionaries arrive at his door, ready to talk to him about their faith, what happens is not what they expected, and not, really, what anyone watching would expect either. Butters does not turn them away. He does not engage with their message in the way they came prepared for. Instead, he tells them about something he has heard. He tells them about the government. By this point in the episode, Cartman's NSA obsession has been running loud enough for long enough that its language has started leaking into the world around him, the way a song you have heard too many times starts playing in your head even when no one is singing it. Butters has absorbed some version of what Cartman has been saying, the broad shape of it, if not the specifics, and what he has absorbed is this: the government is watching everyone. The government knows what everyone is doing. The government is paying attention all the time to every person, everywhere. Butters does not receive this information the way Cartman did, and the difference between their two reactions is, in many ways, the entire engine of this section. Cartman heard that the government was watching everyone and felt flattered, validated, desperate to confirm that he specifically was important enough to be included. Butters hears the exact same information and processes it through a completely different framework, one built from a lifetime of being a polite, well-behaved child in a household that runs on rules, consequences, and the constant low hum of parental disapproval. To Butters, the idea that some enormous, all-seeing entity is watching everything he does, keeping track of his behavior, forming judgments about whether he is good or bad, is not a new idea at all. It is an extremely familiar idea, dressed in slightly different clothes. What Butters does next is take that familiarity and follow it to its logical conclusion, with the specific earnestness that only Butters could bring to something this absurd. If the government is watching everyone, all the time, judging behavior, keeping records, deciding who is naughty and who is nice, then the government is not really a government in the sense that most people use the word. It is something closer to a higher power. It is something that deserves the kind of attention people normally reserve for prayer, for confession, for the parts of life where people try to make peace with whatever force they believe is keeping score. So Butters starts praying to the government. This is delivered with total sincerity, and that sincerity is doing all of the comedic and thematic work at once. Butters does not present this as a joke, does not wink at the camera, does not seem to register that what he is describing is, by any normal standard, an enormous category error. He simply begins addressing the government the way someone might address a deity, talking to it, thanking it, asking it for things. The way a child might ask Santa for a particular toy, except that the toy in this case is a puppy for Christmas, and the recipient of the request is an abstract federal apparatus that Butters has decided is listening. And then, Butters takes the next step, the step that turns this from a private quirk into something that spreads. He decides that if the government is something to be confessed to, then there must be a place where that confession happens. A physical location where a person can go to make things right with the entity that is watching them. He settles on the Department of Motor Vehicle. The choice of the DMV is, on its surface, simply a joke about bureaucracy, about the specific kind of dread that institution provokes in almost everyone who has ever had to interact with. But there is something underneath that joke that is worth pulling out, because the DMV occupies a strange position in American civic life. It is one of the few places where an ordinary person interacts directly with the machinery of government, where the abstraction of the state becomes a physical line, a physical counter, a physical form that has to be filled out correctly, or the whole process starts over. For most people, the DMV is the most tangible, most frustrating, most human-scale point of contact with an institution that otherwise feels distant and faceless. Butters, in deciding that the DMV is the appropriate place to confess to the government, has accidentally identified the one location in town that actually functions as a literal interface between the population and the state and turned it into a church. What happens next is that this idea spreads. Butters recruits the 2 Jehovah's Witnesses who came to his door, not by converting them in the religious sense, but by redirecting their energy entirely. They came to his house to spread one message and leave with another, going door to door, not to talk about faith in the traditional sense, but to talk about the government, about how the government is watching, about how the government wants people to confess their sins at the DMV and be forgiven. The missionaries become missionaries for an entirely different belief system, one that Butters invented in the space of a single conversation, and they carry it through the neighborhood with the same practiced earnestness they would have brought to their original message. The episode plays this almost entirely straight. Nobody in South Park reacts to a new religion centered on government surveillance and DMV confession the way you might expect a town to react to a new religion centered on government surveillance and DMV confession. There is no panic, no outrage, no sense that something strange is happening. People simply start going along with it, the way people in South Park have always gone along, with whatever strange thing happens to be moving through town that week, because resistance has never been the town's natural state, acceptance is. And underneath all of this, quietly, is the thing the section is actually about, the thing that connects directly back to what Cartman discovered inside the NSA building. Cartman found out that the government really is watching everyone, through a system so embedded in ordinary life that nobody had ever thought to question it. Butters, without ever setting foot inside a federal building, without ever seeing a single file or speaking to a single agent, arrives at almost the same conclusion through pure instinct, and then does something with that conclusion that Cartman never considers. He submits to it completely, willingly, joyfully, treating the watching not as an invasion, but as a relationship, something to be maintained, something to be kept right with, something that can forgive you if you go to the correct counter and fill out the correct form. Where Cartman wanted the surveillance to notice him, Butters wants to be in good standing with it. Where Cartman treated being watched as a question of personal significance, Butters treats it as a question of personal goodness. 2 characters, responding to the exact same piece of information, arrive at 2 completely different relationships with the idea of being watched, and neither relationship involves the thing that, in theory, should be the most natural response of all, simply being uncomfortable with it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the end of this stretch of the episode, South Park has produced a whistleblower nobody believes, and a religion built entirely around being watched, and neither of them has changed anything. The next section moves away from government agencies entirely, into a different kind of surveillance, the kind that arrives quietly, inside a software update, from a company everyone already trusts. Section 4. The fine print that builds a human centipede. 2 years before Cartman walked into the headquarters of the National Security Agency, South Park had already told a story about surveillance, and it had told that story without involving a single government agency at all. The 15th season premiere, an episode called Human Centipede, opens on a version of South Park that anyone watching in the spring of 2011 would have recognized immediately, because it was simply the world as it already existed. Everyone has an iPad. Not most people. Not the adults, or the wealthy kids, or the early adopters. Everyone. The device has become so completely standard, so totally assumed, that its absence is the thing that requires explanation rather than its presence. And the person whose life is defined by that absence at the start of this episode is Cartman. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the dynamic the episode opens with is almost a direct inversion of the dynamic from Let Go, Let Gov, even though the two episodes are separated by years and are, on the surface, about completely different things. In that earlier episode, Cartman was the character obsessed with being watched, desperate for the attention of a surveillance apparatus, convinced that mattering and being monitored were the same thing. Here, Cartman is the character left out, the one kid in the 4th grade without the device that everyone else had, and what he wants more than anything else is to be brought inside the system that everyone else has already joined. He is not afraid of what the iPad represents. He is desperate for it. He lies about owning one. He pretends to have one in front of Craig, holding an empty rectangle of cardboard or plastic, the way a person might mime an instrument they cannot actually play, and the other kids see through it immediately, and the embarrassment of being caught matters less to Cartman than the embarrassment of being the kid who does not have one in the first place. Kenny, notably, also does not have an iPad, for the much simpler and much sadder reason that his family cannot afford one. The episode places these two absences next to each other without making a big production of the comparison, but the comparison is there if you look for it. Cartman's lack of an iPad is a problem of ego. Kenny's lack of an iPad is a problem of poverty. The device that the entire town has organized itself around, the thing that has become the baseline requirement for participating in 4th grade social life, is inaccessible to these two boys for completely different reasons, and the episode does not resolve that difference or comment on it directly. It simply lets it sit there, one more detail in the texture of a town where owning the right piece of technology has become a prerequisite for existing normally among your peers. Meanwhile, on the other side of this divide is Kyle, and Kyle's situation is the one the episode is actually built around. Apple has released a new update to its software, the kind of update that arrives constantly, that almost everyone clicks through without reading, that exists primarily as a barrier between a person and the thing they actually want to do with their device. The update comes with a terms of service agreement, the standard wall of legal text that accompanies nearly every piece of consumer technology, written in language dense enough and long enough that the overwhelming majority of people who encounter it do not read a single word of it. They scroll, they find the button, they click agree. The agreement becomes, instantly, a formality so universal that it has stopped functioning as an agreement in any meaningful sense and has become instead a kind of ritual, a tap you perform before the door opens, with no more thought given to its contents than a person gives to the click of a turnstile. Kyle does not read it either. Almost nobody does. But the episode makes a point early on of establishing that Kyle is one of an extremely small number of people in the entire world who has not yet agreed to this specific update, and the smallness of that number matters. The episode is not telling a story about one boy who made a careless mistake that everyone else avoided. It is telling a story about one boy who is, for a brief window of time, in the same position that every single other person on the planet has already passed through, and the only thing separating Kyle from the rest of the population is timing. What happens to Kyle once he does agree to the term? Once he taps the button the way billions of people before him have tapped the same button on their own devices, is the engine of the entire episode, and it begins almost immediately. Apple employees arrive. They are not subtle, and they are not apologetic. They take Kyle. They remove him from his home, from his life, from his family, with the calm, institutional confidence of people who are not breaking any rules, because as far as they are concerned, they are not. Kyle agreed to the terms. The terms, it turns out, covered considerably more than anyone scrolling past them at 2 in the morning while trying to update a music app would ever have guessed. This is the moment where the episode's premise stops being a setup and becomes an argument, and the argument is almost uncomfortably direct once you see it clearly. Every person watching this episode has, at some point, clicked agree on something they did not read. Every person watching this episode has, in some form, signed away some unknown and unexamined set of permissions to some company in exchange for the ability to use a phone, an app, a website, a piece of software that they wanted or needed in that moment badly enough that the alternative, actually reading the document in front of them, was simply never on the table. The episode does not ask the audience to imagine a hypothetical version of this happening to someone else. It shows it happening to Kyle, specifically, as a direct and immediate consequence of doing the exact thing that the audience itself does constantly, without thinking, as a basic condition of using the technology that organizes their daily lives. Kyle is taken to a facility, and inside that facility, he is placed in a cell alongside 2 other people who have also, in their own ways, agreed to something they did not fully understand. The episode does not spend much time individualizing these other captives. What matters is that they exist, that Kyle is not alone, that whatever has happened to him has happened to others as well, on a scale large enough that there is an entire holding area for people in his situation. The surveillance and control being depicted here is not personal. It is not targeted. It is systemic, operating at a scale that produces multiple victims as a matter of routine, the same way the Santa Claus surveillance system in Let Go, Let Gov operated on the entire population, rather than on any single chosen target. And here is where the episode makes its sharpest connection back to the real world, because the terms of service agreement Kyle clicked through did not just grant Apple the right to detain him. According to what the episode shows, it granted Apple the right to perform blood tests on the people who agreed to it. It granted Apple the right to use force against family members who tried to intervene, and to do so with the prior contractual consent of the person being detained, meaning that if Kyle's father were to be physically restrained while trying to help his son, Kyle would have no legal grounds to object, because somewhere in the document he agreed to, he had already agreed not to. The specific horror the episode builds toward, the thing Kyle is actually being taken to become part of, is something the episode names directly by way of its title, a reference to a film that had become a particular kind of cultural shorthand for body horror in the years just before this episode aired. Kyle is going to be surgically connected to two other people in sequence to form a single device, a living network of 3 human beings whose combined biological functions will power something that can browse the internet and send email. The grotesqueness of this image is the point, but it is worth being precise about what kind of point it is. The episode is not simply saying that terms of service agreements are bad, or that technology companies cannot be trusted in some general and toothless way. It is saying something much more specific, that the agreements people sign without reading are not blank documents that simply happen to be long. They are documents that could, in principle, contain anything, because nobody is checking, and the only thing standing between the population and whatever those documents actually say is a collective, universal decision not to look. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kyle agreed to something he never read, and what he is about to become is the most literal version imaginable of what that agreement actually meant. The next section follows what happens once he is inside, and the man waiting there to explain, calmly and reasonably, exactly why none of this should come as a surprise. Section 5. Steve Jobs as the architect of total tracking inside the facility. Kyle meets the person responsible for what is happening to him, and the meeting does not go the way a meeting like this might go in almost any other kind of story. There is no confrontation in the traditional sense. There is no villain monologue delivered with menace, no moment where the person in charge reveals a hidden cruelty that justifies the audience's fear of him. Instead, Kyle meets a version of Steve Jobs who is calm, reasonable, almost gentle, speaking the way someone might speak while explaining a product feature at a launch event, because in his own mind, that is essentially what he is doing. The real Steve Jobs had died only months before this episode aired, and the timing mattered, though not in the way it might seem to at first. The episode is not interested in mocking a person who had just passed away, and it does not really function as commentary on Jobs as an individual at all. What it is interested in is the figure Jobs represented at the height of Apple's cultural dominance, the visionary, the person whose product announcements were treated less like corporate presentations and more like cultural events, the person whose word, on stage, in front of an audience that had been primed for months to receive it, carried a kind of unquestioned authority that very few figures in any industry have ever held. The episode takes that authority and follows it to its furthest possible conclusion. If a man can stand on a stage and have an entire industry, an entire customer base, hang on every word he says about what a new device can do, what happens if that same man decides what a new device can do includes things that should be unthinkable? It helps here to think about what these product announcements had actually become by the time this episode aired. They were not simple business updates delivered to shareholders in a quiet room. They were events, staged with the same care given to theatrical productions, broadcast, dissected, discussed for days afterward by people who had no financial stake in the company whatsoever, simply because the announcements themselves had become a form of entertainment, a form of spectacle, something people looked forward to, the way they might look forward to a new film or a new season of a favorite show. The man at the center of these events occupied a position that was difficult to categorize using ordinary business language. He was not simply a chief executive announcing a product line. He was something closer to a host, a performer, a figure whose presence on stage was itself part of what people were tuning in for, separate from whatever the product actually was. The episode takes this dynamic completely seriously, and that seriousness is what makes the satire work. It does not exaggerate how much authority this kind of figure held over public perception. If anything, it simply simply extends that authority one step further than it had ever actually been tested, and watches what happens. The Steve Jobs of this episode presents the human centipad the same way he might present any other product. There is showmanship in it. There is the sense of an unveiling, a reveal, a moment built for applause. And the audience within the episode, the people gathered to witness this presentation, responds the way audiences at real product launches have always responded, with enthusiasm, with excitement, with the specific kind of collective energy that surrounds the announcement of something new and desirable, even when the thing being announced is, by any reasonable standard, a horror. This is the moment where the episode's argument becomes fully visible, because the horror on display here is not hidden from anyone. It is not a secret program operating in the shadows, the way the NSA's surveillance was framed as something most people did not know about and would be shocked to learn. The human centipad is being presented in public, on a stage, to an audience that is choosing to be there, that came because they wanted to see what Steve Jobs had to show them next. The surveillance and bodily violation at the center of this episode is not hidden. It is celebrated. It is the thing people lined up to witness. There is a specific kind of crowd behavior the episode is drawing on here, and it is worth naming directly because it is something most people have actually experienced in some form, even if never at this scale. Anyone who has ever watched a crowd respond to the unveiling of something new, a product, a piece of technology, a feature nobody asked for, but that is presented with enough confidence that it starts to feel like something everyone secretly wanted, knows how quickly enthusiasm can spread through a room before anyone has had time to actually evaluate what they are looking at. The applause often begins before the thinking does. The episode takes this familiar social dynamic, the contagious, anticipatory excitement of a launch event, and applies it to something that, evaluated for even a moment, would provoke the opposite reaction from almost anyone. The gap between the immediate response and the response that should follow once people actually think about what they just saw is where the satire lives, and it is a gap the episode trusts the audience to feel, because most people watching have felt some version of it themselves, at some point, in some context, watching some crowd cheer for something that, on reflection, probably did not deserve cheering. What makes this work as satire rather than simply as shock is the specificity of what the episode chooses to dwell on once Kyle is inside the device. The human centipad is not just a grotesque image conjured for its own sake. It is described, repeatedly, in the language of product features. It is part human, part centipede, part web browser, part email device. The vocabulary of consumer technology, the vocabulary of specifications and capabilities that gets recited at every product launch, is applied directly to a living arrangement of three human beings sewn together, and the effect of that vocabulary is to make the horror sound, for a moment, like marketing copy. The episode is not asking the audience to imagine some entirely separate fictional horror. It is taking the actual language that real companies use to describe real products and pushing it just far enough that the language itself becomes the joke, because the language was always capable of describing almost anything, as long as it was delivered with enough confidence. This is worth sitting with a little longer, because the specific choice to frame the human centipad in terms of its features, rather than simply its horror, is doing something quietly important. If the episode had simply shown three people sewn together and left it at that, the image would be shocking, but it would not necessarily be saying anything beyond the shock itself. By insisting on describing this arrangement using the exact vocabulary that real companies use to describe real devices, web browsing, email functionality, multi-user capability, the episode draws a direct line between the language used to sell ordinary products and the language that could, in principle, be used to sell almost anything else, provided the audience has already been trained to respond to that language with excitement rather than scrutiny. The horror is not separate from the marketing. The horror is what the marketing was always capable of containing once you stop assuming that the things being described must, by virtue of how they are described, be reasonable. And this brings the episode back to its central thread, the thread that connects directly to Kyle's situation and to the terms of service agreement that put him here in the first place. Throughout the episode, as Kyle and the other people trapped alongside him try to find some way out, the people running the facility repeatedly point out that everything happening to them is, technically, permitted. It is permitted because they agreed to it. It is permitted because somewhere in the document that was presented to them, in language none of them read, in a font and at a length specifically designed to be skimmed past rather than absorbed, the possibility of exactly this outcome was disclosed, and their acceptance of that document constituted their consent. There is a particular detail the episode returns to that captures this dynamic with unusual precision, and it concerns tracking. At one point, it is suggested that even when an Apple device is switched off, even when it appears to its owner to be completely inert, completely disconnected, completely off, it remains capable of being located. The device that a person believes believes they have turned off, the device they believe is no longer doing anything, is still, in some sense, present, still capable of being found, still part of a system that does not actually stop simply because the screen has gone dark. This detail did not arrive in a vacuum. In the months before this episode aired, there had been a real and widely covered controversy involving location data stored on Apple devices, a story that revealed phones were logging and storing detailed records of where they had been, going back months, in a format that was not encrypted and that, in some cases, users were not fully aware existed. The story became known, in the shorthand that news coverage often settles into, as a kind of location gate, and it generated exactly the sort of brief, intense wave of concern that these stories tend to generate. A flurry of articles, a public response from the company involved, a promise that the issue would be addressed, and then, within a relatively short period of time, a return to normal, with the underlying behavior of the devices largely unchanged and the public's attention having moved on to something else. What is worth noticing, looking back at that controversy now, is how closely the public reaction to it followed a pattern that this entire video has already traced multiple times. The story broke. People were briefly alarmed. Articles were written, comparisons were drawn, questions were asked about what else companies might be collecting without users knowing. The company responded. The response was treated as sufficient, and the story faded. Nothing about the underlying technology changed in any way that addressed the actual concern. The phones kept recording location data. The capability that had caused the brief wave of alarm remained exactly as present as it had been before anyone noticed it. The only difference being that, for a few weeks, people had been talking about it, and then they stopped. The episode takes this real controversy and asks a question that the news cycle itself never really asked. Not directly, not in those terms. If a device can track its owner's location continuously, even when that owner believes the tracking has been disabled, even when the device appears to be off, what is the actual difference between that capability and a literal physical leash? The episode does not answer this question through dialogue or argument. It answers it through the plot itself, through Kyle's actual physical situation, surgically attached, unable to leave, located precisely and continuously by the very company that put him there, using a device he was told he could control, and that, in practice, he never controlled at all. What gives this section its particular edge, and what separates it from a simpler joke about technology being scary, is the calm. Steve Jobs, in this episode, is never angry. He is never even particularly defensive when challenged. When people object to what is happening, when Kyle's father eventually appeals to him, the response is not a cornered villain lashing out. It is something closer to genuine, if limited, reasonableness. The response of a person who has simply never had to seriously consider the question of whether what he is doing is acceptable, because the agreements were signed, the terms were accepted, and as far as the system he operates within is concerned, that settles the matter completely. There is something almost gentle, in fact, about how the episode handles the eventual resolution of Kyle's situation, and that gentleness is itself part of the point. When Kyle's father appeals to whatever sense of decency this version of Steve Jobs might possess, the appeal works, not because it overturns the logic of the agreement, but because it operates entirely outside that logic, as a kind of personal favor granted by someone with the authority to grant it, rather than as a correction of anything systemic. Kyle gets out. The agreement, the terms, the document nobody read, remains exactly as it was, available to be invoked again the next time someone agrees to it without reading it, which, the episode makes clear, is simply what everyone does, all the time, as a basic condition of using the devices that have become impossible to function without. The horror of the episode, then, is not that Steve Jobs is a monster in some operatic sense. The horror is that he does not need to be. The agreements do the work. The consent, however it was obtained, however little anyone understood what they were consenting to, is treated as total, and once it is treated as total, almost nothing that follows requires justification, because the justification was secured in advance, in a document nobody read, at a moment nobody remembers, in exchange for an update nobody actually needed. Kyle's release does not undo any of this. It simply removes Kyle, individually, from a system that remains exactly as available to everyone else as it was before, waiting for the next person, the next update, the next button, clicked the way every button before it was clicked, without anyone stopping to ask what, exactly, they had just agreed to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kyle eventually gets out, but the episode does not pretend the underlying problem goes anywhere with him. The next section leaves corporations behind entirely and follows a different kind of watching, the kind that starts as a child's toy flying over a quiet neighborhood and ends with something much larger circling overhead. Section 6. A drone in every window. The episode that takes South Park's surveillance arc in its next direction begins with something almost aggressively small. There is no government agency involved. There is no corporation, no terms of service agreement agreement, no facility, no Steve Jobs delivering a calm explanation for why something terrible is technically permitted. Instead, the episode called The Magic Bush opens with Butters sitting with Cartman, looking at photographs of bird eggs. This opening is worth pausing on because of how completely unremarkable it is. Butters has been out with his father, Steven, doing something wholesome and slightly old-fashioned, the kind of activity a parent and child might do together on a weekend, with no particular agenda beyond simply being outdoors and paying attention to something small. He has photographs. He wants to show them to Cartman. Cartman, in keeping with the established shape of his character, could not care less about bird eggs, and makes this clear with the specific bluntness that Cartman brings to most things that do not directly serve his own interests. The photographs themselves are presented as exactly what they claim to be: slightly blurry, slightly amateurish images of nests and eggs taken from an angle that would have been impossible for a person standing on the ground to capture, and the pride Steven takes in them is the pride of someone who has found a new way to see something old. What changes the entire trajectory of the episode is not the bird eggs themselves, but the device that took the photographs of them. Steven, it turns out, has taken up drone flying as a hobby. He owns a drone, a quadcopter, the kind of consumer device that had, in the years leading up to this episode, become increasingly common, increasingly affordable, and increasingly unremarkable as a piece of technology that ordinary people might simply own for fun. The drone is framed, at first, exactly the way Steven seems to understand it, as a tool for taking pictures of things from above, things like bird eggs, things that are interesting, precisely because most people never get to see them from that angle. He talks about it the way a person talks about any new hobby they have recently picked up, with a kind of mild, slightly proud enthusiasm. The enthusiasm of someone who has found a small way to make ordinary weekends feel a little less ordinary. There is nothing in how Steven describes this hobby that suggests anything other than a man who likes birds, likes gadgets, and likes spending a few hours on a Saturday with his son doing something neither of them had ever done before. Cartman's interest is instant, and it has nothing to do with bird eggs. The moment Cartman learns that Butters has access to a device that can fly, unsupervised, into places a person normally cannot see, his mind goes somewhere that Steven's never did, and the speed of that shift is the entire joke of this opening stretch. Steven looked at a drone and saw a way to photograph birds' nests from above. Cartman looks at the same drone and sees something else entirely, a way to look into places he is not supposed to be able to look, at people who do not know they are being looked at, without any of the inconvenience that has historically made this kind of behavior difficult to get away with. There is no elaborate scheme here, no planning, no hesitation. The thought arrives fully formed, the way Cartman's worst thoughts almost always do, and he moves toward acting on it almost before the thought has finished forming. This is, in its own way, a small but precise illustration of something the episode never states outright: the difference between what a piece of technology is designed for and what a piece of technology can be used for is often nothing more than the difference between the person holding it. What follows is one of the more uncomfortable threads the show has ever pulled on, and it is uncomfortable specifically because of how mundane the setup is. Cartman convinces Butters to bring the drone along, framing it as something harmless, something fun, an extension of the same activity Butters and his father had already been doing together. The framing matters because it is the same framing Cartman has used countless times across the show to get Butters to participate in things Butters would never agree to if he understood from the start what was actually being asked of him. Butters is not being asked to do something he recognizes as wrong. He is being asked to do something that looks, on the surface, like a continuation of something good, something he already did with his father, something that felt safe and ordinary just hours earlier. The escalation, when it comes, does not arrive as a single decision. It arrives in small steps, each one slightly further than the last, none of them individually large enough for Butters to plant his feet and refuse, until the cumulative distance between where they started and where they end up is far larger than any single step would have suggested. Kenny comes along too, in the way Kenny often does, present for whatever is about to happen without necessarily having chosen it, a kind of background witness to events he neither initiates nor objects to, at least not at first. Kenny's presence in scenes like this has always carried a particular quality, because Kenny rarely speaks, and the show rarely explains what he is thinking. He simply exists alongside whatever is happening, a participant by proximity rather than by intention, and his silence here functions almost like a kind of ambient consent, the way a crowd's silence can sometimes be read as agreement, even when no individual member of that crowd actually agreed to anything. And what the three of them do with the drone is fly it around the neighborhood, looking into windows, looking into yards, looking at the ordinary private lives of people who have no idea that a small flying camera is currently positioned outside their home. The episode does not rush through this. It lingers, briefly, on the sheer ordinariness of what the boys are seeing as as the drone passes over rooftops and through backyards, because the ordinariness is the point. There is nothing dramatic happening in any of these homes. People are simply living, doing the small, unremarkable things people do when they believe no one is watching, which is most of what anyone does, most of the time, and which only becomes interesting, only becomes something worth looking at once someone else realizes they can look. A person watering a lawn, a person watching television, a person doing nothing at all, simply existing in a space they have every reason to believe is theirs alone. None of it would mean anything to anyone under any normal circumstance. The only thing that has changed is that someone is now positioned to see it who was never meant to be. This is where the episode introduces its central incident, the one that everything else in the story will spiral outward from. The drone, flying where Cartman directs it, ends up positioned outside the home of Craig Tucker's family, and it captures footage of Craig's mother, Laura, in a state of undress. Footage that includes a clear and unobstructed view of something private that she had no reason to believe anyone outside her own home would ever see. The episode does not treat this as an abstract violation. It treats it as exactly what it is: a woman in her own home, behind walls and windows that have functioned for as long as houses have existed, as the boundary between a person's life and the world outside it, being recorded without her knowledge by a device that ignored that boundary completely, simply because it could. The walls of Laura Tucker's house were never designed to account for the possibility that someone might be watching from above, because for almost all of human history, nothing capable of watching from above existed at a scale or a cost that would make this kind of intrusion realistic for an ordinary household to worry about. A window on the second floor of a house, facing away from the street, has always been understood as private, not because of any specific rule or law, but because privacy at that height, at that angle, was simply guaranteed by physics. Nothing could reach it, nothing could see it. The drone changes that calculation instantly and completely, and it does so using technology that, by the time this episode aired, was sitting on shelves in hobby stores, available to anyone with a moderate amount of disposable income and no particular reason to be regulated or monitored themselves. What makes this moment land the way it does is the total absence of malice in how it happens. Cartman did not set out that morning with the goal of recording Laura Tucker. He set out with the much vaguer, much more familiar goal of looking at things he was not supposed to look at, the kind of goal that has motivated children for as long as there have been fences, windows, and places marked as off-limits. What changed is not the goal. What changed is the reach. A child standing on the ground, pressing his face against a gap in a fence, can see a narrow sliver of a backyard and nothing more. A drone, hovering at the height of a second-floor window, can see directly into a bedroom, and the only thing separating those two scenarios is altitude. An altitude that, until very recently, was simply unavailable to anyone without a ladder, a helicopter, or a reason serious enough to justify either. Cartman's response to what the drone has captured is immediate, and it follows the same pattern that has defined his character across every episode in this arc so far. He wants to share it. The footage of Laura Tucker is not something Cartman experiences privately and then moves past. It is content. It is something to be shown to other people, something with value, precisely because of how private it was supposed to remain. And Cartman treats the violation of that privacy as an asset rather than a problem. He brings it up almost immediately, telling Kenny that the footage needs to stay secret, and then, within moments, undermining that secrecy himself by bringing it up again to other kids, unable to resist the pull of having something other people do not have, something that makes him, briefly, the center of attention in exactly the way he always wants to be. The instruction to keep something secret and the immediate violation of that instruction happen so close together that they almost collapse into a single act, and the show frames this not as hypocrisy in any deliberate sense, but as something closer to an involuntary reflex. Cartman cannot hold information that makes him interesting. The holding of it is, for him, a kind of waste. What gives this section its real weight, though, is not Cartman's reaction, which is more or less exactly what anyone familiar with the character would expect. It is Butters' reaction, and Kyle's, once Kyle finds out what happened. Butters is uncomfortable from very early on. He is the one who initially frames the drone as something for looking at bird eggs, something connected to a wholesome activity with his father, and the moment that framing gets violated, the moment the drone is used for something he clearly understands is wrong, Butters' discomfort is immediate and genuine. He is not performing reluctance the way characters sometimes do before going along with something anyway. He actually does not want this to happen, and his objections are met in the way Cartman's victims' objections are almost always met, with manipulation rather than argument. Cartman does not convince Butters that what they did was acceptable. He simply makes continuing to object feel like more trouble than it is worth, and Butters, who has spent the entire run of the show being worn down by exactly this kind of pressure, goes along with it, carrying the guilt of that decision in a way way that becomes visible across the rest of the episode. At one point, Butters confronts Cartman directly about it, telling him they should confess, that what happened was wrong and that the right thing to do is to admit it. Cartman talks him out of it, the way Cartman always talks people out of things, not by winning the argument, but by making the argument feel pointless. And Butters backs down, even though the discomfort never fully leaves him. He carries it visibly in the small hesitations and sideways glances the show gives him whenever the subject comes back up, a kind of low hum of guilt running underneath everything else he does for the rest of the episode. Kyle's reaction when he eventually learns what happened is the episode's clearest statement of what the violation actually represents. Kyle overhears Cartman and Butters discussing it, and his disgust is not played as an overreaction or as Kyle being uptight in the way the show sometimes frames his moral objections. The recording of a private moment inside someone's own home without their knowledge or consent, and the subsequent decision to treat that recording as something worth sharing, is presented through Kyle's reaction as exactly as serious as it sounds, stripped of any of the comedic distance that might otherwise soften it. Kyle does not laugh. He does not treat it as a prank that went slightly too far. He treats it the way most people would treat it if it happened to someone they cared about, which is to say, as something that should not have happened at all, and something that cannot simply be forgotten because the people responsible would prefer it to be. His confrontation with Cartman is brief, but it is one of the few moments in the episode where the show's comedic register drops away almost entirely, and what is left underneath it is something closer to plain anger. And underneath all of this, quietly, the episode is setting up something larger. The drone that captured this footage was not a piece of specialized surveillance equipment. It was not something built for a government agency or acquired through some elaborate scheme. It was a hobby device, purchased the way someone might purchase a bicycle or a telescope, owned by a parent who wanted to take pictures of birds with his son. The capability to look into someone else's home from above, to record what happens inside private spaces without any of the people inside those spaces knowing, had become, by this point, something that did not require infiltration, did not require hacking, did not require any institutional power at all. It required a credit card and an afternoon, and the rest followed from there, almost on its own, the way Cartman's worst ideas always seem to find the path of least resistance once the right tool happens to be sitting in front of him. There is also something worth noting in how quickly the footage moves once it exists. Cartman uploads it. Once something exists online, in this episode as in the real world, it stops belonging to the person who created it and starts belonging to everyone who encounters it, copied, shared, viewed, in ways that cannot be tracked or undone. The episode does not dwell on this technical reality, but it does not need to. The footage is out almost the moment it is created, and the rest of the episode unfolds in the world that exists after that fact, a world where something private has become permanently, irretrievably public, and where the question of who is responsible for that becomes increasingly difficult to untangle from the question of who simply happened to be holding the camera when it happened. By the time word of the footage spreads through the neighborhood, something has already shifted that none of the adults involved seem to fully register. A line that used to exist, the line between what happens inside a house and what happens outside it, has been crossed, not through any dramatic break-in, not through any obvious crime in the traditional sense, but through a toy. And the response to that crossing, once it begins, will not stay contained to the people directly involved. It will spread outward into the rest of the neighborhood in a way that will make the original violation look, in retrospect, almost quaint by comparison. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One drone flown by a child has already shown how easily a private home can stop being private. The next section follows what happens once the rest of the neighborhood decides the answer to that problem is more drones, and how quickly a solution to surveillance turns into surveillance of its own. Section 7. When the watchers get watched once. Word spreads through South Park about what happened to Laura Tucker. The response that follows is not the response anyone inside the episode seems to expect, and it is not the response anyone watching the episode would expect either, at least not at first. Nobody asks who flew the drone. Nobody organizes around the question of who is responsible for what happened, or what should be done about the footage that is already circulating. Instead, the conversation shifts almost immediately to something else entirely, the drone itself, and what its existence means for everyone else. The adults of South Park gather, the way the adults of South Park always seem to gather whenever something has gone wrong, in a meeting that is ostensibly about addressing a problem, but that quickly becomes something closer to a referendum on an entirely new way of living. The framing that emerges from this gathering is that what happened to the Tuckers is evidence of a threat that could happen to anyone at any time without warning. Someone, somewhere, with a drone could be watching any house in the neighborhood at any moment, and there would be no way to know. The privacy that everyone had assumed they possessed simply by virtue of living behind walls and closing closing their curtains has been revealed to be an illusion, and the question on the table is what to do about that. The answer the town arrives at is almost perfectly circular, and the episode does not soften the irony of it in any way. The solution to the discovery that drones can be used to violate privacy is for the neighborhood to acquire more drones. This is presented within the episode as a kind of neighborhood watch program, and the language used to describe it borrows directly from the language of community safety initiatives that exist in the real world, the kind of program where residents agree to keep an eye on each other's homes, to watch for anything unusual, to report anything suspicious. The drone, in this framing, stops being the instrument of the violation and becomes, instead, the instrument of the response to it. If a drone can be used to spy on people, the logic goes, then the way to protect people from being spied on is for everyone to have a drone of their own, watching, presumably, for the kind of behavior that led to the original incident in the first place. What this means, in practice, is that within a very short span of time, the skies above South Park fill with drones. Not one drone, flown occasionally by a single hobbyist father and his son, but many drones, flown continuously by multiple households, all of them framed as serving the same protective purpose, keeping watch over the neighborhood, looking out for anything that might represent a danger to the people living there. The episode does not need to spell out what has actually happened here, because the visual alone does the work. A neighborhood that, only days earlier, had been horrified to discover that a single drone had been used to look into a single window, now exists under a sky filled with drones, all of them capable of doing exactly the same thing, all of them flying with at least the implicit justification that this is what they are for now. The violation that triggered this entire response has not been undone. It has been multiplied, repackaged as safety, and distributed across the entire community, until the thing everyone was afraid of has become the thing everyone is doing, all the time, to each other. This is where the episode introduces its second major shift, and it is the shift that gives the episode its real shape. Once the neighborhood watch drones are established, flying their patterns above the streets and houses of South Park, another layer arrives to watch them: police drones. The justification for this escalation follows the same logic as the one before it, only one step further removed. If private citizens are now flying surveillance drones over the neighborhood, drones that are capable of looking into windows, of recording private moments, of doing exactly what the original drone did to Laura Tucker, then someone needs to be watching those drones to make sure they are not being misused the way the original drone was misused. The police, in this framing, are not introducing a new form of surveillance into the neighborhood. They are simply extending an existing principle, the same principle the residents themselves used to justify their own drones, one level higher. And so now there are two layers of drones in the sky above South Park. Neighborhood watch drones, flown by residents, ostensibly protecting the neighborhood from threats like the one that started this entire chain of events. And police drones, flown by the authorities, ostensibly protecting the neighborhood from the neighborhood watch drones, which were themselves a response to a threat that by this point has receded almost entirely into the background, mentioned by no one, addressed by no one, simply absorbed into the infrastructure of the town as though it had always been there. The episode's most pointed moment in this stretch involves Randy Marsh, and the way the show chooses to deliver it says a great deal about what the episode is actually arguing. Randy is shown operating one of the neighborhood watch drones, and the drone he is flying is painted black, in contrast to the white drones flown by everyone else in the neighborhood watch program. The color is not incidental. Randy uses his drone to spy on a neighbor, a man named Peter Nelson, catching him in a private moment with his wife, the exact kind of moment the entire neighborhood watch program was supposedly created to prevent anyone from being able to see. A police drone intercepts Randy's drone and shoots it down. The justification given is that Randy's drone was peeping, which is true, and which is also exactly what every other drone in the sky above South Park, neighborhood watch or otherwise, has been doing or is capable of doing at any given moment. The difference between Randy's drone and every other drone in the program is not behavior, it is color. Randy's drone is black, the others are white, and the episode lets this distinction sit there, unexplained, unjustified, functioning as the only visible difference between a drone that gets shot down for surveillance and an entire fleet of drones that continue operating, unchallenged, doing the exact same thing. It is difficult to watch this sequence without thinking about the real-world context the episode is drawing from, and the episode does not try particularly hard to obscure that context. In the months before this episode aired, the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri had become one of the defining news stories of the year, sparking protests, unrest, and a national conversation about policing, race, and the use of force by law enforcement against black communities. The episode does not restage that story directly, and it does not need to. What it does instead is take the basic shape of that story, an individual singled out and met with lethal force in a way that other individuals, behaving identically, are not, and transplant that shape onto drones, removing the specifics entirely while preserving the structure. A black drone, doing what white drones around it are also doing, gets shot down. The episode trusts the audience to recognize what it is referencing without ever needing to say so. What follows the shooting of Randy's drone is the episode's final and most direct escalation. The other neighborhood watch drones, the white ones, respond to the destruction of Randy's drone not with indifference but with grief, and then with protest. They gather, holding what the episode frames as a candlelight vigil, a tribute to the drone that was destroyed, the kind of gathering that, in human terms, would be immediately recognizable as a memorial, a public expression of mourning and anger over a death that the community has decided was unjust. The police drones respond to this gathering not by engaging with its substance, but by treating it as a procedural violation. The candles, the police drones determine, represent a fire hazard. The vigil is not treated as a form of protest that might require some kind of acknowledgement or response to the concerns being raised. It is treated as a rules infraction, a technical violation of some unstated safety code, and the police drones move to break it up on those grounds. This is the moment where the episode's drone storyline stops being contained and becomes something much larger. The neighborhood watch drones, faced with a police response that refuses to engage with the reason for their gathering and instead treats their grief as a logistical problem to be cleared away, escalate further. What began as a peaceful vigil becomes a confrontation, and the confrontation becomes a riot. Drones against drones, filling the sky above South Park in a conflict that has no obvious resolution and no obvious endpoint, because neither side in this conflict is capable of articulating what it actually wants, beyond simply continuing to exist in the position it currently occupies. And then, in the episode's final escalation, the government enters the picture directly. National Guard drones are deployed, not to mediate between the neighborhood watch drones and the police drones, not to address whatever grievance originally caused the unrest, but to end the riot itself, using whatever force is necessary to restore order to a situation that the government's own drones had no role in creating. By the end of this sequence, the episode has built, step by step, an entire hierarchy of surveillance and force, each layer introduced as a response to the layer beneath it, each layer justified by the failures of the layer it was meant to correct, and none of it tracing back to anything resembling a solution to the actual problem the episode opened with. Laura Tucker's privacy was violated by a single drone, flown by a single child, for reasons that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with curiosity and cruelty. By the time the episode ends, that violation has produced a sky full of competing surveillance systems, a riot, and a military response, and at no point in that entire escalation does anyone stop to ask whether any of it has made anyone in South Park any safer or any less watched than they were before any of it began. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A children's prank with a drone escalated into a riot that needed the National Guard to end it, and nobody in South Park seemed to notice how strange that escalation actually was. The next section leaves the neighborhood behind entirely and follows a different kind of escalation, one that did not require any animation at all, because by the time it happened, the real thing was already on television. Section 8, Towelie walks into occupied Washington. By the time the episode this section is built around aired, South Park had been running for more than a quarter of a century, and over those decades, the show had developed a particular relationship with current events that no other piece of television had ever quite managed to replicate. Most shows that want to comment on the news either build that commentary in months in advance, locking jokes and references into scripts long before anything airs, or they avoid topicality altogether, preferring stories that will not feel dated the moment the news cycle moves on. South Park, almost uniquely, had spent years operating on a production schedule tight enough that episodes could be written, animated, and broadcast within days of the events they were responding to. By the time the 27th season arrived, this capability had become something the show was not just known for, but actively leaned into, turning its premiere weeks into a kind of running commentary on whatever happened to be dominating headlines at that exact moment. The third episode of that season, titled Sycophancy, arrived in this context, and what it depicts is not a fictional government or an exaggerated stand-in for American institutions. It depicts Washington, D.C. as it existed at that specific moment, responding to a specific set of real events that had unfolded only days before the episode aired. In the weeks leading up to this episode, the President of the United States had announced a federal takeover of the Washington, D.C. Police Department, framing the move as a response to crime, homelessness, and disorder in the capital. Hundreds of National Guard troops were deployed into the city. The administration announced it would install what was described as an emergency commissioner into the Metropolitan Police Department, effectively placing the city's own police force under direct federal control. The move drew immediate legal pushback. pushback, with the city's attorney general filing suit against the administration, arguing that the takeover was unlawful. It also drew public criticism from a range of voices, including at least one prominent actor who, in a widely circulated video, raised the question of what city might be next, listing other major American cities by name and asking whether this kind of federal intervention might simply continue spreading from place to place. This is the environment Sycophancy steps into, and the way it chooses to step into it is, on its surface, almost absurdly simple. The episode follows Towelie. For viewers unfamiliar with the character, Towelie occupies a strange and specific place in South Park's ensemble. He is, literally, a talking towel, anthropomorphic, perpetually high, prone to wandering into situations with a kind of cheerful obliviousness that has, over the years, made him one of the show's most reliable sources of pure absurdity. Towelie does not carry political opinions. He does not carry an agenda. He exists, primarily, to be present in places, to comment on what he sees with a stoned, good-natured detachment, and to occasionally remind everyone around him that he has a towel in case anyone needs to dry something off. Sending a character like this into Washington, D.C. at the exact moment the city was under federal occupation is, in itself, a choice that says something before a single line of dialogue has been spoken. The episode does not send one of the show's more politically engaged characters, the kind of character who might be expected to have opinions about federal overreach or constitutional authority. It sends the towel. It sends the character whose entire function across decades of the show has been to wander into situations with no understanding of what is happening and respond to everything with the same blissed-out enthusiasm, regardless of what that everything actually is. The episode opens with Towelie arriving in Washington by bus, and the imagery that greets him is presented without exaggeration, or at least without exaggeration beyond what was already, at that moment, a matter of public record. The sky over the city is depicted as dark, oppressive, the kind of sky that in any other context would signal the arrival of a storm or some kind of disaster. Armed troops are visible, military vehicles, tanks among them, are stationed near landmarks that anyone watching would recognize immediately. The Supreme Court building, the White House, the Capitol. These are not generic government buildings standing in for some fictional capital. They are the actual buildings, rendered in the show's familiar style, surrounded by the actual kind of military presence that had, in the days before this episode aired, become a regular feature of news coverage out of Washington. Towelie's response to all of this is the joke, and it is also, somehow, the argument. He looks at the tanks, the troops, the militarized streets of the nation's capital, and his reaction is enthusiasm. He sees the White House lawn, surrounded by all of this, and what he says, in essence, is that this seems like a perfect place for a towel. There is no fear in his reaction. There is no recognition that anything unusual is happening. Towelie processes an occupied capital city the same way he might process any other location he happened to wander into, as a place that exists, that he is now present in, and that might be a nice spot to relax. This response works on more than one level at once, and the episode does not seem interested in choosing between them. On one level, it is simply the Towelie joke, deployed in its most familiar form, a character whose obliviousness has always been funny, placed into a situation where that obliviousness becomes funnier specifically because of how serious the situation actually is. The greater the gap between what is happening and how Towelie reacts to it, the bigger the joke. But on another level, Towelie's reaction is doing something else, something closer to what the cold open of an essay might call an unanswered question, stated with enough specificity that it does not feel generic. If a talking towel can wander into the middle of a militarized capital city and respond with nothing but cheerful interest, what does that say about how normal this has become? The joke depends on Towelie not noticing that anything is wrong, but the joke also depends, just as much, on the audience noticing exactly how wrong it is, and noticing that the gap between Towelie's reaction and the audience's own reaction is the entire point. Towelie is not commenting on the occupation. Towelie is the control group, the character whose reaction shows, by contrast, what an unaffected response to this situation would actually look like, and how far that unaffected response sits from anything resembling a reasonable one. As Towelie continues through the episode, the satire widens beyond the immediate imagery of troops and tanks. The episode turns its attention to figures beyond the administration itself, specifically to technology executives, depicting them in postures of deference toward the president, going out of their way to align themselves with an administration that, only scenes earlier, had been shown occupying the Capitol with military force. The specific mechanics of these portrayals matter less than what they represent collectively. An image of institutional power, both governmental and corporate, converging around a single figure, with very little daylight visible between the interests of the state and the interests of the companies whose products and platforms increasingly mediate how ordinary people experience the world. This convergence connects, even if the episode does not draw the line timeline explicitly back to everything this entire video has covered up to this point. The NSA's surveillance, hidden inside Santa Claus, Apple's terms of service, granting a corporation the right to do almost anything to a person who agreed to an update they never read. The drones, multiplying from a single hobbyist's toy into a militarized response involving the National Guard. Each of these stories, on its own, involved either government power or corporate power, but rarely both, operating together, visibly, in the same frame. Sycophancy puts them in the same frame. Troops in the streets, executives in the room with the president. The episode does not need to explain what it means for these two kinds of power to be shown converging this directly, because by this point in South Park's history, and by this point in the real world the show is responding to, the convergence itself had become the story, reported on, debated, and increasingly difficult for anyone to treat as a fringe concern. The episode also finds room for a detail that, on its surface, seems like pure absurdist set dressing, but that carries its own weight once you sit with it. The Lincoln Memorial, reimagined within the episode in a way that updates its imagery to reflect the current administration. The specifics of this reimagining matter less than the underlying gesture, which is the show taking one of the most recognizable monuments in the country, a monument specifically associated with a president, remembered for preserving the Union during its greatest internal crisis, and altering it to reflect the figure currently occupying the office. The gesture is jarring precisely because the Lincoln Memorial occupies a kind of sacred space in the American civic imagination, one of the few pieces of government architecture that exists almost entirely outside of partisan argument, treated by nearly everyone, regardless of political affiliation, as a monument to something larger than any single administration. Touching that monument, even in cartoon form, even as a joke, registers differently than touching almost anything else in Washington, because it suggests that nothing, not even the things previously understood as permanent, is actually outside the reach of whoever currently holds power. Towely's journey through all of this eventually brings him to the Oval Office itself, face to face with the president, and the episode ends this particular thread the way Towely storylines tend to end, without resolution, without consequence, simply with Towely present in a space that, only an episode ago, would have seemed like the least likely place in the world for him to end up. The towel that started the episode on a bus, commenting on how nice a spot might be for relaxing, ends the episode inside the most powerful office in the country, having walked there through a city under military occupation, without ever once registering that anything along the way had been unusual. What makes Sycophancy different from everything else covered in this video is not its subject matter exactly. Surveillance, government power, the blurring of lines between corporations and the state, the normalization of military presence in civilian life, all of these threads run through every episode this video has examined so far. What makes Sycophancy different is its distance from the events it depicts. Let Go, Let Gov responded to a surveillance story that had broken months earlier. Human Centipad responded to a location tracking controversy that had already cycled through the news and largely been forgotten by the time the episode aired. The Magic Bush drew on cultural anxieties around drones and policing that had been building for years. Sycophancy responded to events that were, in some cases, less than a week old. The troops were still in the streets when the episode aired. The lawsuit was still active. The administration's response to the previous episodes of this same season was still a live story. South Park, in other words, was not looking back at this moment from any kind of safe historical distance. It was standing inside it, animating it in close to real time, sending a talking towel to walk through the same streets that, at that exact moment, real soldiers were walking through, and asking, through a character who could not possibly understand the question, whether anyone watching still found any of this strange. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The episode aired, the towel walked through Washington, and within days, Washington walked back. The next section follows what the government actually said about being mocked this directly, and what that response reveals about how seriously satire is being taken at the highest levels of power. Section 9. The White House responds. There is a particular kind of moment that occurs when a piece of satire lands well enough that the people being satirized feel compelled to respond to it directly, and that moment had become, by the time of South Park's 27th season, almost a recurring feature of the show's release schedule. This was not new. South Park had spent decades provoking responses from public figures, religious organizations, foreign governments, and media companies, responses that ranged from formal statements to legal threats to, in at least one well-documented case, an entire episode being quietly removed from circulation in certain markets due to pressure from a government that did not appreciate how it had been depicted. What made this particular season different was not that a response came, it was who the response came from, how quickly it arrived, and what it revealed about the relationship between a long-running cartoon and the actual machinery of the federal government. Before Sycophancy even aired, the season had already drawn a reaction. Earlier in the season, an episode had taken aim at the administration's immigration enforcement action, and the response to that episode had come not from a spokesperson issuing a vague statement about taste or relevance, but from the Department of Homeland Security itself, an actual federal agency, responding online to a cartoon. The specifics of what was said matter less than the fact that it happened at all. A federal department, one of the largest and most powerful agencies in the entire government, had felt it necessary to publicly respond to a comedy show in real time, in the same online spaces where ordinary people post about their days. This is, on its own, a strange enough development that it would have been remarkable even as an isolated incident. But it was not isolated. It was a pattern, and the pattern continued. After Sycophancy aired, depicting the federal takeover of DC's police department, the response escalated again, and this time it came from the White House directly. A spokesperson for the administration addressed the episode, and the language used in that response is worth sitting with carefully because of what it reveals once you set it against everything else happening at the same time. The show was described, in essence, as irrelevant, as a program that had not mattered in over 2 decades, dismissed in terms meant to suggest that whatever it said carried no real weight, that it was the complaint of a has-been, easily ignored, beneath the notice of anyone with actual power. And yet the White House said this, out loud, in an official capacity, about a cartoon. This is the contradiction at the heart of this section, and it is a contradiction the episode itself, in a sense, had already anticipated without needing to say so directly. If South Park truly were irrelevant, if it truly had not mattered for over 20 years, the obvious response to an episode depicting troops in the streets of Washington would be no response at all. Silence is the natural reaction to something that does not matter. Nobody holds a press conference to dismiss something nobody is paying attention to. The act of responding, the act of standing behind a podium or issuing a statement specifically to say that something does not matter, is itself an acknowledgement that it does. The dismissal and the response cancel each other out, and what is left, once you strip away the language of the dismissal itself, is simply the fact of the response. The federal government of the United States, at the level of the White House, felt that an episode of South Park required a public answer. This dynamic did not begin with Sycophancy, and understanding where it sits in a longer history helps clarify what is actually new about it. Earlier in the same season, the show's premiere had already drawn criticism from the administration, framed within a broader complaint about satirical media more generally. Around the same time, a separate and unrelated controversy involving the cancellation of a late-night talk show had become its own major story, with hosts across the television landscape responding to what many of them characterized as a chilling effect on satire and political comedy. The administration's posture towards satirical media across multiple fronts during this period was not passive. It was active, vocal, and willing to use the platforms and authority of government offices to push back against comedy that it found objectionable. Set against that backdrop, the response to Sycophancy reads less like an isolated overreaction to a single episode, and more like the continuation of an established pattern, one where a long-running animated comedy show, of all things, had become enough of a perceived threat that multiple arms of the federal government across multiple weeks found it necessary to respond. There is also a financial dimension to this story that adds another layer to what was happening, and it concerns the people who actually make the show. In the period surrounding this season, the creators of South Park signed an enormous deal with a major media company, reportedly worth over $1 billion across several years, covering new episodes and streaming rights to the series. This deal is worth mentioning not because of its size in isolation, but because of what it represents about the position South Park occupied at this exact moment. This was not a struggling show, clinging to relevance, desperate for attention, the kind of show that might lash out at a powerful administration as a last gasp at remaining culturally significant. This was a show whose creators had just been handed one of the largest deals in the history of television, a show with more institutional and financial backing behind it than at almost any other point in its run, choosing, at the height of that backing, to spend its season premiere weeks directly engaging with the most powerful office in the country. The episode's content and the timing of that deal sit next to each other in a way that says something about leverage. A show with $1 billion deal behind it, airing on a major platform, watched by a large and engaged audience, occupies a different position than a show without those things. It can afford to provoke a response. It can afford to be the subject of a White House statement, because the consequences of that statement, whatever they might once have been for a smaller or more vulnerable production, are considerably less threatening to a show backed by this kind of institutional weight. The episode was not made by people worried about what might happen if the government noticed it. It was made by people who had, in effect, already secured their position before the episode aired, which may be part of why the episode was willing to go as far as it did. What also stands out, looking at this period as a whole, is how the criticism functioned less as a deterrent and more as confirmation of the episode's own argument. Sycophancy depicted a convergence of government and corporate power, troops in the streets alongside tech executives currying favor with the administration, and within days of that episode airing, the actual government responded by treating a cartoon as a meaningful enough threat to warrant an official statement, dismissing it in the same breath that it acknowledged it. The episode said, in effect, that institutional power had become thin-skinned, reactive, and unable to simply ignore criticism, even criticism delivered by a talking towel. And then, institutional power proved the point, publicly, on the record, within the same news cycle. There is a version of this story that could be told as a simple victory narrative. The satirists provoked the powerful responded defensively, and the satirists were vindicated. But the more honest version of this story is less clean than that, and it connects back to something this video has touched on repeatedly across every episode covered so far. In Let Go, Let Gov, Cartman discovered that the government really was watching everyone, and that discovery changed nothing, because nobody believed him, and nobody, including Cartman himself, seemed to actually want anything to change. In Human Centipede, Kyle was released from his ordeal, but the system that produced that ordeal, the terms of service, the corporate authority, the casual consent nobody actually gave in any meaningful sense, remained completely intact, ready to do the same thing to the next person who clicked agree without reading. In the Magic Bush, the drone riot ended, presumably, the way these things tend to end in South Park, without any actual resolution, without anyone learning anything, without any change to the underlying conditions that produced the riot in the first place. Sycophancy and its aftermath follow the same shape. The episode aired. The White House responded. And then, within days, the news cycle moved on, the way news cycles do, toward whatever the next story happened to be. The troops remained in Washington. The legal disputes over the takeover continued through the courts, on their own schedule, unaffected by anything a cartoon had said about them. The administration continued doing what it had been doing before the episode aired, and South Park continued doing what it had been doing for 27 seasons. And the brief moment where these two things directly addressed each other, where a federal government and an animated towel occupied the same news cycle, passed the way these moments always seem to pass, without anything underneath actually shifting. What remains, after all of it, is the documentation. The episode exists. The White House statement exists. The lawsuit exists, somewhere, working its way through whatever process lawsuits like that work their way through. And the gap between what was said and what was true, the gap between calling something irrelevant while responding to it as though it were anything but, remains exactly as visible as it was the moment it happened, available to anyone who wants to look at it. The same way the gap between Santa Claus and a surveillance database remains visible to anyone who decides to think about the Santa Claus story for more than a few seconds. South Park did not need to argue that institutional power was reactive, defensive, and uncomfortable with being looked at too closely. It simply made something, and institutional power proved the argument by responding to it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A cartoon got an answer from the White House, and the answer it got proved more than anything the episode itself could have said outright. The final section pulls every thread of this video together, from the NSA, to the drones, to the towel in the Oval Office, and asks what 2 decades of this kind of satire actually adds up to. Section 10, 20 years of watching The Watcher. There is a way of looking back at everything covered in this video that treats it as a list. 4 separate episodes, 4 separate targets, 4 separate jokes that happen to share a loose theme. The NSA episode, the Apple episode, the drone episode, the Trump episode. 4 entries in a long-running show's catalog, connected by subject matter the way episodes about food or episodes about weather might be connected, simply because they happen to share a word that could be used to describe them all. But looking back at these 4 stories together, in sequence, the way they have been presented across this video, something else becomes visible, something that does not show up if you watch any one of these episodes in isolation. What emerges is not 4 separate arguments about surveillance. It is one argument told 4 times across more than a decade in 4 completely different contexts, with the show arriving at roughly the same conclusion each time, even as the specific target of its attention changed completely. Start with where this video started. Let Go, Let Gov aired in the weeks after one of the largest surveillance disclosures in American history, and the episode's central joke was that the government really was watching everyone through a system so deeply embedded in ordinary cultural life that nobody had ever thought to question it. Santa Claus, a story told to children, repeated by parents, treated as harmless for generations, revealed to be, underneath all of that, a literal surveillance mechanism, hiding in plain sight because nothing about it ever looked like surveillance. Now consider Human Centipede, which aired 2 years earlier, but which this video placed second because of how directly it extends the same idea into a different domain. Where Let Go, Let Gov found surveillance hiding inside a children's story, Human Centipede found it hiding inside something almost everyone interacts with directly, constantly, without thinking: the terms of service agreement. The mechanism by which Kyle ended up surgically attached to two strangers was not a secret government program. It was a contract he had agreed to, the same way billions of people agree to contracts like it every single day, by clicking a button without reading what the button represents. Then there is the Magic Bush, which took the idea further still, removing institutions entirely. No government agency, no corporation, just a hobby device, available to anyone, that turned out to be capable of doing something that, only a few years earlier, would have required resources that only governments or large organizations could access. And the response to that capability, once it was discovered, was not to question whether anyone should have access to it. It was to acquire more of it, layer upon layer, until the sky itself became a battleground between competing forms of the exact same technology, each layer justified by the failures of the layer beneath it. And finally, sycophancy, which collapsed the distance between satire and reality almost entirely, sending a character into a version of Washington that was, in nearly every visual detail, simply Washington as it actually existed at that moment, troops and tanks and all, and which then provoked a response from the actual government, a response that proved, almost by accident, the very point the episode itself was making. 4 episodes, 4 different mechanisms: Santa Claus, a terms of service agreement, a consumer drone, an actual military deployment, and in every single case, the surveillance, the watching, the control, arrived disguised as something else, something familiar, something that nobody had any particular reason to be suspicious of, until the moment the disguise came off and revealed what had been underneath it the entire time. This is, perhaps, the closest thing to a unifying argument that this entire body of work makes, even though no single episode states it directly, and even though the episodes themselves were made years apart, by people responding to whatever happened to be in the news at the time, without any larger plan connecting one to the next. The argument is this: the most effective surveillance, the most effective forms of control, are never the ones that announce themselves as surveillance or control. They are the ones that arrive wearing the clothes of something else: a children's story, a software update, a toy, a neighborhood safety initiative, a National Guard deployment framed as a response to crime. In every case, the thing being described is, on its surface, something ordinary, something that most people would have no reason to object to, something that might even sound, on first hearing, like a good idea. And in every case, underneath that surface is something considerably larger and considerably less benign than the surface suggested. What makes this pattern worth dwelling on is not just that South Park identified it once, cleverly, in a single episode that happened to land at the right cultural moment. It is that the show kept finding new versions of the same pattern across more than a decade in completely different domains, responding to completely different news stories and arriving, each time, at a structure that looked remarkably similar to the structure it had used before. This did not happen because the writers were working from some master plan, mapping out a unified theory of surveillance across multiple seasons. It happened because the pattern itself is real, and because once you have identified it once, you start seeing it everywhere, in whatever happens to be the news story of a given week, because the pattern is not really about any specific technology or any specific institution. It is about how power of almost any kind tends to behave when it grows large enough, and how the public, faced with that power, tends to respond. Consider for a moment how each of the 4 episodes handled the question of consent, because this turns out to be another thread running through all of them, quieter than the surveillance itself, but just as consistent. In Let Go, Let Gov, nobody consented to anything. The Santa Claus surveillance system was simply there, built into a story that had existed long before any of the people being monitored by it were even born, inherited rather than agreed to, absorbed the way language or customs are absorbed, without any moment where a person could meaningfully have said no. In Human Centipede, the consent was technically present. Kyle did click the button, but the episode goes out of its way to demonstrate that this consent was meaningless, extracted through a process specifically designed to ensure that nobody involved understood what they were agreeing to. In the Magic Bush, the consent was even stranger. The Neighborhood Watch drone program was something residents apparently agreed to, or at least went along with, as a response to a violation that had already happened without anyone's consent at all, meaning the supposed solution to a consent violation was itself something nobody had been meaningfully asked about either. And, in Sycophancy, the question of consent barely registered, because the episode depicts a situation, federal troops occupying a capital city, where the people most directly affected, the residents of that city, had no meaningful say in the decision at all. Across all 4 episodes, in other words, the people being watched, controlled, or occupied are never meaningfully asked. The watching happens first, first, justified or explained afterward if it is explained at all, and the explanation, when it comes, almost always takes the form of safety or protection, or some version of an argument that the watching exists for the benefit of the people being watched, rather than at their expense. There is also something worth noting about who, across these 4 episodes, actually objects to any of this, because the answer is remarkably consistent, and it says something about how the show distributes its own moral clarity. In Let Go, Let Gov, Kyle is annoyed by Cartman's obsession, but never actually objects to the surveillance itself in any substantive way. The closest thing to genuine discomfort in that episode comes from the audience's own recognition of what Cartman has stumbled into, not from any character within the show. In Human Centipede, the objections come from Kyle's family, people with a direct personal stake in what is happening to him, rather than from any broader recognition that what happened to Kyle could happen to anyone. In The Magic Bush, Kyle objects again, this time clearly and directly, to the original violation of Laura Tucker's privacy, but his objection has no effect on anything that follows. The escalation into neighborhood drones, police drones, and eventually the National Guard happens entirely independent of whether anyone thinks it is a good idea. And in Sycophancy, the objections come not from within the world of the show at all, but from outside it, from the real administration responding to the episode itself, an objection that, as discussed in the previous section, ends up validating the thing it was objecting to. What this adds up to is a body of work where the people with the clearest view of what is actually happening, the audience watching these episodes, are consistently positioned ahead of the characters inside them. Kyle gets closer than most, across these 4 episodes, to recognizing the actual stakes of what he is witnessing, but even Kyle's recognition rarely translates into anything that changes the outcome. The surveillance happens, the escalation happens, the occupation happens, and the show's characters, for the most part, either fail to notice, or notice and are unable to do anything about it, or, in Cartman's case, actively want more of it because of what it might mean for their own sense of importance. This is where the personal note belongs, the place where this video steps back from the structure of the argument and towards something closer to what watching all of this, back to back, across more than a decade of episodes, actually feels like. What is striking, sitting with these 4 episodes together, is how little any of them have aged. Let Go, Let Gov is now well over a decade old. The specific surveillance disclosure it was responding to is, for many younger viewers, something they were too young to remember happening in real time, a piece of history rather than a piece of news. And yet the central joke of that episode, that the most effective surveillance hides inside the most familiar things, has not become any less true. If anything, it has become more true, because the things people interact with constantly, the apps, the devices, the platforms that organize daily life, have only multiplied since that episode aired, and the terms attached to all of them have only grown longer, denser, and less read. Human Centipede is now well over a decade old as well, and the specific location tracking controversy it referenced has long since faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer controversies about newer technology, each one generating its own brief wave of concern before fading in turn. But the underlying structure Human Centipede identified, agreements nobody reads, granting permissions nobody understands, to companies whose products have become functionally mandatory for participating in ordinary life, has not gone anywhere. If anything, it has become so normalized that even raising it as a concern can feel, at this point, almost quaint, the way pointing out that water is wet might feel quaint. Of course nobody reads the term. Of course the terms could say almost anything. Everyone already knows this, and almost nobody does anything differently because of it. The Magic Bush is the most recent of the 4 episodes prior to Sycophancy, and it occupies a strange middle position, because the specific technology it was responding to, consumer drones, has continued to become more common, more capable, and more woven into both private hobbyist use and official law enforcement use since the episode aired. The riot at the center of that episode, drones against drones, escalating into a conflict that required military intervention to end, might have read, at the time, as a piece of pure absurdist exaggeration. It reads somewhat differently now, in a world where drone technology has continued to advance in exactly the directions the episode imagined, used by hobbyists, used by police departments, used by militaries, often in ways that blur the lines between those categories in ways that would have seemed far-fetched only a few years earlier. And Sycophancy is barely old at all. By the time anyone is watching this video, the specific situation in Washington that the episode depicted will likely have moved on to whatever came next, the lawsuits resolved or still pending, the troops redeployed or still present, the news cycle having long since turned its attention elsewhere. But the structure the episode identified, government power and corporate power visibly converging, satire treated as a genuine threat by people who claim it does not matter, will almost certainly still be recognizable, because that structure does not depend on any many of the specific details that made this particular episode feel so immediate when it aired. It depends on something more durable than any single administration or any single news cycle. What 2 decades of this kind of work adds up to, in the end, is not really a body of prediction, even though it sometimes gets discussed that way, as though the show possessed some kind of foresight that allowed it to anticipate where things were heading. What it adds up to is something closer to a method, a way of looking at whatever happens to be in the news and asking a single, consistent question. What is this thing actually doing underneath what it claims to be doing, and who benefits from nobody asking that question? Applied to a children's holiday story, that question reveals a surveillance system. Applied to a software update, it reveals a contract nobody understood. Applied to a toy, it reveals a riot waiting to happen. Applied to a federal response to crime, it reveals troops in the streets of the nation's capital and an administration sensitive enough about being mocked for it to issue an official statement calling the mockery irrelevant. None of these revelations changed anything within the world of the show. The surveillance continued, the contracts continued, the drones continued, the troops continued, but the revelations exist now, recorded, animated, broadcast, watched by millions of people, available to be returned to, the way this video has returned to them and sat with for a little longer than the original news cycles ever allowed anyone to sit with the things these episodes were actually about. That, more than any specific joke or any specific target, might be the thing worth taking away from all of this. Not that South Park predicted anything, but that it kept noticing the same thing over and over for more than 20 years, and that the thing it kept noticing has never once stopped being true. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.